Hey everybody, thanks for being with me. I'm Elysabeth Alfano, and I am here today on the Plant-Based Business Hour. I am so happy to have everybody with me. It's always such a joy. So twice a year, I try to do a state of plant-based business type of podcast, sort of see where we are and how things have progressed, what challenges we have, where we're going. As we're just about to hit the middle of 2021, I thought that I would do that here today. And of course, to do that, I want to bring on the experts in the field. So welcome to Julie Emmett, who is the Senior Director of Retail Partnerships at the Plant-Based Food Association.
Hi, Elizabeth. Wonderful to be here.
So happy to have you with me. And then Caroline Bushnell, who is the Vice President of Corporate Engagement at the Good Food Institute. Thanks for being here, Caroline.
Thanks for having us, Elizabeth.
Okay, so now your organizations, Good Food Institute and Plant-Based Foods Association, you've worked together. You're both deeply involved in doing research to further the plant-based industry, and I'm grateful for that. I'll say before we get started, both of your organizations are a wealth of knowledge, so you can always go to plantbasedfoods.org or gfi.org. Both of you have in-depth research reports out now. We're going to talk about Plant-Based Foods Association retail research report to begin with, but know that you can go there for more stats if you find anything interesting here. And the same is true for gfi.org. You can download their state of the industry reports. So much knowledge in there. We're going to get to some of it today, of course, but we won't be able to get to everything. So get your hands on those reports. I can't stress it enough. So today's conversation, I'm going to kind of focus on plant-based foods, which really we're going to talk about retail, and then we'll talk with talking with Julie, and then we'll switch over and talk with Caroline. But of course, these conversations are going to come together, and it will be a group conversation, the three of us. I'll start with Julie. So you being the Plant-Based Foods Association, have put forth a very detailed retail report on sales for 2020. This was also with the assistance of GFI. My favorite stat is that over the last 2 years, sales were up 43 times more than the regular food industry, which was up 9 times, I believe. So very interesting data there. Tell me, what are some of your favorite stats that have come out of that report?
Mm-hmm. So it's up 43% in the past 2 years. And yes, 9 times faster than total food.
Thank you, 43%, 9 times faster.
Yes, all good. All good. Yeah, I think one of the, the first one that comes to my mind is that those that identify as flexitarian, so even just jumping right to the shopper, has grown to 47%, almost half the population identifies as flexitarian. Those that want to eat meat and dairy, actively seeking to reduce their meat and dairy intake or eat it only occasionally. So that just broadens the shopper base so significantly, which is definitely behind that massive growth. We're seeing significant trial and repeat numbers, just seeing really strong. When we talk about accelerated growth, we're not talking about that it was just an anomaly. I mean, this 27% growth in the past year was double what it was last year. And we really took a step back to study what was happening underneath that. What are the shopper behaviors? What's really happening with that shopper to see is this sustainable growth? There's a very easy to try to discount, or to think about that this is a year to discount. And in many cases, the whole industry was up, total food was up 15%, which is astronomical for total food. It's usually flat to up 2%, but with restaurants, 110,000 restaurants closing. But with as the industry opens back up, we'll start to see, and we're starting to see those growth numbers decline. And but plant-based foods, we've taken an early read for this year, and it continues to have double-digit growth. So our assumptions were correct that it's sustainable growth.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions for you is, do you have a read already on 2021? And it seems that it's sustainable growth, because it's not just 2020, but as you were saying, it's 2019 and even 2018, I believe, was a very good year. So we're seeing 20%. This. Yeah, 20%. So we're seeing this trend continue. I'm wondering what grocery stores are doing with this data. I want to interject here. Every year you do this sales report to see where we are, but you've also done other reports. And one of my favorite was when you did a test, I believe it was with Impossible Foods, where you put the plant-based meats in the meat counter in the meat section, you saw that sales went up, I believe, 23% across the United States, and it was 32% in the Midwest, where they don't get enough plant-based action. So retailers must be looking at this kind of data that you provide them and thinking there's a lot more money to be made here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just a quick, so it wasn't a brand specific. So we did this.
It wasn't brand specific.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I should say that. So the idea was, beyond specifically pave the way to have placement in the meat department, but the test was really to be able to see all plant-based meat, packaged, sliced, crumbles, roasts, all jackfruit, all different types of meat in the meat department, to see how would the shopper react to that, how would sales respond to that. So yeah, so that's was really some trailblazing, just in terms of getting the attention, because we as PBFA, we invest in research and work with retailers with the idea that they will be sharing it with the industry. We shine a light on their thought leadership, and then they are able to, graciously, in a way, share their results. I mean, they could very easily keep those insights to themselves to grow just by themselves, but we share it and we shine a light, and that inspires the rest of the industry to take a look at their merchandising, to understand what should they be doing with plant-based food? Should they be following suit? And we continue to build on that research. In fact, we're continuing to work with Kroger and other retailers to understand, does it make the most sense to be next to its animal-based counterpart, or does it make more sense to expand into a larger, into an expanded, dedicated plant-based food? There's a lot of different options. We know what we feel. We know that shoppers are looking. We know that shoppers are looking for their plant-based food next to their animal-based counterparts. That's the mainstream shopper. That's what they're looking for. As we get there, the recommendation is to choose a strategy and do it well and make it easier for shoppers to find, because we know that. We see this tremendous growth. We know that it's not even reached its potential now, because in many cases it's not on a shopper's list. They're not looking for it. If they want it, it's not on their list. If they don't see it, if they're not going into that separate section, they're not going to buy it. And so really just our mantra is make it easier for the shopper to find what they want.
Yes, because there seems to be pent-up demand. Caroline, hop in anytime if you'd like to comment. Yeah.
I was just going to add on that actually last year, GFI released our Good Food Retail Report, which highlights a lot of the data that PBFA and GFI collected, but also some of the best assortment, merchandising, and marketing strategies for plant-based foods, and talks a lot about this move to an integrated, segregated merchandising placement, which is really what we saw in the natural and organics product industry. As it moved from a niche category to more mainstream, it kind of left that separate store within a store placement and moved, right next to the conventional products to make it easier for consumers when they're shopping for that purchase occasion.
Mm-hmm. I've already seen this difference post-COVID. Well, I guess we're just at the tail end of COVID in my own grocery store. So I have a Ralph's near me, which would be under the Kroger umbrella, I believe. And it used to be plant-based was over in this corner by the things that were on sale and the employee bathroom. But now they've moved, specifically plant-based cheeses have moved in with regular cheeses. And I think that is a huge step forward, because plant-based cheese doesn't have the kind of penetration that, let's say, plant-based milks does. Plant-based milks already being next to their animal analog counterparts. So a big jump for plant-based cheese. I'm curious what both of you are seeing from the retail perspective in terms of their willingness, and I'll say perhaps their change in willingness over the last year to embrace plant-based foods. I'm guessing they're agnostic. They don't really care one way or the other. They just want to sell things. So have they come to you and said, help us, we get it now? Or what has that conversation been like?
I can answer that. I'll go first.
Yeah, how about it?
Yes, they are actively reaching out.
Yes.
It used to be that it was the internal influential champion that we would be working with, that we're very grateful for, to make things happen. But now category managers, researchers, the research teams, the marketing teams are actually reaching out, asking for help in terms of research, in terms of integrated marketing events, in terms of what we recommend for signage, what's the best verbiage for signage. I mean, it's really exciting to see that because the reality of it is, we're still in the early stages in terms of size, but the growth and the drivers behind it, when you combine health, which now has been heightened with COVID, with a focus on immunity, combine that with the environment and the awareness of zoonotic diseases and the correlation with animals and food safety and the environment, people are really understanding all of this. And so retailers, I give them so much credit. They're always focused on the shopper. They really know that they need to address and satisfy their shoppers' needs. And so I'm seeing just a really tremendous focus on making sure they do it right and creating a long-term strategy, which is just really impressive to see.
Yeah, it is really impressive. Please, Caroline.
I will just second what Julie said. I think, one, the velocities are starting to speak for themselves. So we're seeing these products turn, right, faster and faster. And as they're being integrated with the conventional counterparts, we're seeing category penetration increase as well. So more shoppers are coming into these categories. And a lot of the core shoppers and the flexitarians, as Julie spoke about, often have higher basket rings. So they're really valuable shoppers that retailers want to make sure are coming to their stores, and they're not losing them to another store, because not only will they lose that plant-based food purchase, they'll lose that entire basket purchase. So we've been seeing the same thing, a lot of inbound requests, and interestingly, actually a little separate from plant-based, but we've had some retailers coming to us asking how they can be early in cultivated meat. Oh. So that's pretty exciting as well.
Wow. Because that is a big step, because they know that the consumer doesn't really understand cultivated meat yet. So, plant-based meats, perhaps people got the memo. This was really a nice segue into my next question, which is, what kind of role does the retailer see for themselves in terms of education? How willing are they to educate in terms of merchandising, but also perhaps, if you're Whole Foods and you've got a larger landscape around welcoming people, sometimes Whole Foods has restaurants, and, I've been to Whole Foods that have wine bars, and they really try to keep people and almost entertain them. I'm wondering how open the retailer is to education, and the education curve for cultivated is a big one. I'd love to hear what you both think on that. Yeah.
Well, some of the retailers that have came to us interested in cultivated meat, yes, that is part of their question, right? They're looking to us of, how do we introduce this? How do we help this succeed? Because we're really excited about the potential, also as they think about some of their corporate sustainability commitments, right? So they're looking to us for that guidance. They don't necessarily have those answers yet, but I think they are open to anything they can do, right, to increase the velocity of products in their stores and bring more consumers into these higher margin, often, at least for now, higher price point products.
Yeah, education is the other part of the mantra. It's just so critical and a massive undertaking. And I think in terms of the direct question, what are retailers doing? They're, a big part of what we lost during COVID was the ability to demo product, for example, which is a great way for discovery. So there are now ways to what the term is digital demoing. So, and it's very targeted. In general, education is becoming much more targeted, which is obviously more efficient, the right method to do regardless of category. So there's ways to target consumers, send them, a free coupon with education, and then a bounce back coupon, and a way for them to post on social media about their experience, and really showing some great results. And so retailers are partnering with them. And most times retailers have loyalty card where they're able to mine that really great data. And that's something that we as organizations, GFI and PBFA, are looking to really dive in to understand the actual behavior by following households, what they're actually purchasing over time, and is there displacement of animals? Is it purely incremental? But they also use this data, and it's important to us, obviously, but what's important to the retailer is to understand who they're talking to and how they can communicate, how they can best communicate. And it's a really incredible tool to provide digital coupons to be able to just communicate with them in the way that they consume their media.
Yeah, as you said in the beginning, they're so focused on the consumer, which is just as business should be. And I'm really still jaw-dropping that they're interested in cultivated meat before it's even regulated. I mean, this is before there's actually really even a product if we're talking about the United States, so so very fascinating there. Julie, do you see, and also, Caroline, do you see that technology is entering into the space for education? So I'm kind of waiting for the day when I can walk down the aisle with my phone and I can see non-GMO, the top 7 ingredients, where the food was sourced from, et cetera. Are we going to see that kind of innovation coming out of the grocery store? Caroline first, if she's got it.
Right.
I don't know. I think that's very possible, and that there would be consumer interest, and I can see it going there. We've started seeing some digital shelf tags, right, where they can put different product attributes, for example, and more easily change sales prices. So I could absolutely see that.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Julie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that Amazon's paving the way with all the different strategies that they're trying, touchless, they don't even have to interact with anybody. You can leave the store and somehow you're charged for what you purchased. I think that they're really paving the way, and they're trying a lot of different strategies. And I think that once that's flushed out, then that will, hopefully provide some intelligence for the rest of the industry.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, sort of a global question about the state of grocery stores, I guess. Mostly we're interested in plant-based, but just in general, how they're going to function. I'm wondering if they're seeing their role as different, as almost, I like to say, like grocery store shopping, the ride, that they have to do more to compete against just ordering your food from Amazon or Instacart, or just going and getting your food from an app that has every meal delivered, or even a meal kit service. Now they've got so much more competition. Again, Caroline first maybe, but what do you see in terms of retail reimagining itself?
Sure. Well, I think some of the changes we saw during COVID are going to stick around, right? So it's gotten awfully convenient to just, pick out your groceries online based on your past purchases that they all have recommended right there for you, and then just drive up, wait in your car, and have somebody bring them out. So I think the type of convenience that we've become accustomed to is going to stick around. Same with delivery. Kind of on the flip side, though, I think there's going to need to be probably some other solutions as more brands are now launching DTC. So we know during COVID, right, a lot of category resets where buyers evaluate the newest products to put on shelf were being put on hold, and they weren't resetting shelves. And so a lot of brands, and we saw this in the plant-based space, trying to launch products, had to find another way to initially come to market. And so we've seen a lot more direct-to-consumer product launches. And there's definitely some benefits to that, right? You can get those customer reviews, you can get that early feedback, and kind of iterate before you go and gain that shelf space that if you lose it once, it's very, very hard to get back. So I think there's going to be more innovation there, and grocery stores are going to look at how they address that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just hop in there as well and say it is very expensive to get grocery store distribution. So D2C is a great way to start. And you then can also develop, not just your product and tasting and feedback, but you develop that one-on-one relationship with your client. I'm always telling my clients at Plant Powered Consulting, plant-based is no longer enough. You just can't put out a product and say, well, it's plant-based and hope for the best. I mean, plant-based is thankfully becomes such a big market, including sometimes flexitarians, if you want to say that. Are you going for the older person who's interested in health? Are you going for the younger person who's taking a stand for the environment? Are you going to the mom who's concerned about her family? So you really have to know that consumer so intensely now. There's also this heightened sense of distrust between large corporations and the consumer. So the consumer really wants to know what your brand stands for and what is behind your product in terms of the values. So it's really a great opportunity with D2C to establish that profound relationship. But Julie, I want to ask you something, because you said, we're looking at the data to see if this is really displacing plant-based products or really displacing animal products. And I'm wondering, from the grocery store perspective, and also what you're seeing in your data, are the grocery stores seeing plant-based as a yes and? So they're not really getting rid of meat, they're just bringing on more diverse options in plant-based? Or I'd love to know what you're finding there.
So from a retailer's perspective, incremental is the best word, right?
Okay.
To grow everything. So the research right now has not been able to track a shopper long enough to know what's actually happening. And that's combined with the very large size that animal-based meat has of the total meat category. So plant-based meat is, let's just call it 2%. So it takes, it's going to take, to be able to see that direct displacement, it will be, a period of time. But what our focus is right now is to partner with retailers to track those shoppers over time to see, did they buy animal-based meat? Now they've added a plant-based meat. Now they've converted over to plant-based meat, and what other plant-based categories now are they buying that they weren't buying before, and just track that journey.
Wow. When will you have that data?
Hopefully by the end of the year.
Really? Okay. I will look for that, as will everybody else. Caroline, you wanted to hop in there.
Yeah, I'll add one thing there, because there was one study done by Impossible Foods specific to their brand. So they did kind of a switching analysis based on retail sales data. And what that showed, and it was only over, I think, maybe a quarter or so. So a short time frame. Normally these are done over a year. And this is an analysis that we're looking at doing as well. But what Impossible Foods found for their own brand, and I don't have the numbers up, so approximate here, but it was something like about 20% of all of their product sales were incremental to both the plant-based and animal-based meat categories, right? So to Julie's point, that's a pretty great story for the retailer to get 20% incremental. Mm-hmm. That means about 80% was sourced from either within the plant-based category or the animal-based category, from switching from another product. And when they dug into that, actually about 90% of that was consumers switching from an animal-based meat product, not another plant-based meat product. So in total, when you do all that math, that amounts to about 70% of the product sales from that brand during that period were being sourced from animal-based meat. And I've heard this conversation happening in our industry recently about, is this really displacing? And so our early indicators are yes, for a large percentage, especially when we're thinking about this next generation product, right? That is really competing organoleptically with conventional products. But to Julie's point, it's early days, and plant-based meat has about 1.4% of the total meat category in retail. So that dollar discrepancy, it's still going to take quite some time before we actually see conventional meat sales start to decline as a result, just because of the sheer difference in absolute volume.
Mm-hmm. And I want to clarify here, we're really talking about U.S. numbers, correct? So we're not talking about global numbers, we're talking about U.S. numbers. But I want to switch a little bit to the GFI State of the Industry reports that you all have put out. And I think the number there is 4.2 billion in the meat category for plant-based meats of a $1.4 trillion global meat market, so about 3%. Would that be accurate?
Yes. And I think that was up around 27% or so last year. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but over double-digit growth the previous year. So we're actually seeing very similar trends globally, not just in the US, but for the level of retail sales data we can get in the US, it's hard to get those types of numbers globally. So that is Euromonitor data. And there was actually an effort in Europe, the Smart Protein Project, that looked at Nielsen sales data for Western Europe. And we've also seen that same kind of growth. And interestingly, while the US plant-based meat category is worth $1.4 billion, in Europe, the plant-based meat category is actually worth 1.4 billion euros, and saw just about the same percentage growth over last year. So what's really great is we know this isn't, one of the questions I think people have kind of stopped asking, but we used to get a lot was, is this really a shift or is it a fad, right? And fads usually come up really quickly, and they're limited in geographic scope, right? But we're seeing these trends, the steady growth upwards across the globe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so very exciting. And you mentioned the other products that are coming online and those technological advances that are going to make them organoleptically, did you say? I've never heard that word before.
Yes.
Learning something on my own show. Yes. They're going to make them similar, if not exactly that replacement product. So let's talk about fermented proteins and cultivated meat. Let's start with fermented proteins only because I'm so excited about cultivated meat, but I think fermented proteins are going to get there first, if that's even the right way to think about it. But more importantly, I think you're going to crack the code for cheese when you're talking about fermented proteins. So for those who might not know, if Caroline would like to share, or I can share what a fermented protein is.
Yeah, I'm happy to explain. So most people probably think of fermentation as the traditional type of fermentation, right? So brewing beer or kombucha or bread. But there's two other ways, and tempeh is made that way as well. But there's two other ways we're seeing fermentation increasingly used in the alternative protein industry, both to create functional ingredients. So that's kind of what you're alluding to there with cheese, but also to create end products, the kind of whole biomass itself. So the two types of fermentation there, it's whole biomass fermentation, which also can be used to create ingredients, which companies like Mycotechnology are doing. And actually, one of their ingredients is kind of one of the star ingredients in JBS, its subsidiaries, Planterra Foods, new plant-based burger. They're using a fermented shiitake mycelia. So it can be used as ingredients, but also to create the plant-based meat product itself through often it's mycelium. And so we have this densely structured filamentous fungi that allows for much more of that meat-like texture that is really hard to replicate in plant-based proteins. So that's one category and is pretty game-changing on both those fronts. But then I think a little more what you were alluding to is the precision fermentation, which is to oversimplify a bit, it's taking microbial hosts and really programming them to be cell factories to produce specific functional ingredients that normally would only be found in animal products. And so companies are doing this to allow for products that have either better sensory, functional, or nutritional characteristics to really improve otherwise plant-based products. So we're seeing that right now in dairy. Perfect Day has already brought some products to market. Brave Robot Ice Cream, which is a partner brand of theirs, is on supermarket shelves now. So they do casein and whey protein. There's several others in the dairy space though too, Change Foods, New Culture, Formo. So we're seeing a lot of innovation there that yes, should get to your much more organoleptically similar cheese. We're also seeing there's a vegan collagen a animal-free collagen that Geltor recently announced, and Clara Foods, who's working on egg proteins, also really recently announced their first product coming to market.
Yeah, this is such an exciting arena. And I think what makes it so exciting isn't just the breadth of the products that you've talked about and their one-to-one replacements, but how quickly they're going to get to market, as I understand it. Just to throw out a couple names there, since we're naming people, Super Brewed and Remilk and Better Dairy and the Vegan Cowboys. I mean, there's lots of people working around the globe on cheese and dairy options that would have precision fermentation, as you say, basically giving the cliff notes of how to make animal proteins to microbes that then can just go ahead and produce them and follow the directions without being in an animal. So it's non-animal animal protein. It's a little bit mind bending, which is why my next question is going to be, how do we talk about this stuff to the consumer? But first I want to talk about timelines. So when do you think we'll be seeing yogurt, milk, cheese products with fermented proteins, precision proteins on the market?
Well, first, I think it's important to note, because this might sound new and different to a lot of folks, but this technology is actually already widely used and actually in our food industry. So rennet, which is a key ingredient in conventional animal cheese, the majority of it is now produced this way. If you look on the back ingredient deck of most cheese products, it would say either non-animal rennet or vegetarian rennet, because it was originally produced from something from the lining of calf's stomach. This is also how insulin is being produced now, instead of using pigs. So it's also a common way that our supplements are produced. So while we're seeing new applications in the alternative protein industry, it's not a new technology or even new in our food system. So I think that's important for folks to understand. Your question, timelines, when will we start seeing this? I think we could see new product categories this year. Mostly what we've seen is ice cream on shelf made with perfect days, but I know some of these other companies that both you and I mentioned are focused on cheese or other dairy products. Nature's Find, which is doing both plant-based meat and also they're doing some plant-based yogurts. They just received a no questions letter from the FDA based on their GRAS submission. So I wouldn't be surprised if those products come to market soon. So I would say we'll probably see some more this year and certainly in the coming years. So yeah.
Yeah, so very exciting.
Time.
I've had all of the Nature's Find products in their lab, just really very exciting. And as you say, it's not new technology, but it is new to the consumer. And the consumer is on a new path of wanting to know what's on their food. Before, they really didn't want to know about this. They just sort of took craft at their word and they said, okay, well, then this is what we'll eat. And now they're no longer doing that. They want to know, what is this made of? Where does it come from? And what does it mean to me? Julie, what are you seeing? Is this on the radar at all for the retail grocery stores? Are they ready to accept this kind of product, and do they even know that it's coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, we do get questions on, can we explain this to them? How should they be thinking about it? How should they be merchandising it? That's a key component. So we just, that's not our area of expertise. That's not something that we're involved in. That's why we work very closely with GFI, so we can, make sure that we're not, in many ways, research and so we're complementing each other and supporting each other. And so if I'm not able to answer the question,
you can send it to, yeah. And probably vice versa. So with that in mind, Caroline, how are you telling people to think about that? I mean, we're talking about it here, but again, even though we're saying it's not too new technology, we're sort of talking about it in a technological way. So what are your thoughts on the best way to communicate with the consumer about what's coming down the pipeline?
Right. Yeah. Well, a couple other things to note. Of course, it's really important to be transparent and make sure consumers understand it. Because as you were even saying, right, the idea of an animal-free animal protein is hard to convey with just one or two words, right? So I've seen a lot of the leading companies in the space are devoting a lot of space, for example, on their websites to actually step-by-step explaining how these proteins are produced, which is important. And I think some on-pack education will probably be important as well. But another example of this technology in market is in the Impossible Burger. The soy hemoglobin they have is produced using this same methodology, and it has really given it that game-changing, right, taste and appearance. So I don't know that as long as it has the FDA regulatory approval or and has achieved its GRAS status. I don't know that the retailers are so focused on any one specific ingredient in the product. As far as what the category is called, we've really seen most of the players coalesce around the term precision fermentation to explain the process. And a lot of them are focused on using the modifier animal-free in front of whatever the product is to help explain, okay, it's and that this also follows the precedent of rennet being a non-animal rennet, but they're kind of, I think, leaning into the terminology of animal-free, so an animal-free dairy. And yes, there's probably, again, on pack or on their websites, ways they can further explain what that means and how that is produced until this becomes a more common ingredient in products across the store.
Yes, I was part of the community conversation about what to call this through Plant Powered Consulting. Some of the leaders in the space asked me to look at what was bubbling up as the possible terms, and animal-free was also where I was landing as well. I think that communicates it best, and such a very exciting time for the consumer, because most consumers, they know about factory farms. They tend to maybe turn away because they don't know what to do about it. And here they have a solution. Most people don't want to hurt animals. Most people know what factory farms and would not like that to be their only option in their choice of preferred foods. So what a liberation for the consumer, who is always sort of just push this idea in the back of their head so that they can get on and do their grocery shopping. And now they don't have to. I think that's going to be a big relief for them, and potentially a source of something to communicate from the companies to the consumer. But
I really
Julia,
want to interject there and just say
please.
that retailers are the closest to the consumer, and that's who we really do need to rely on. And that's why the fact that we do have close relationships, and it's on behalf of the industry. It's not one brand's agenda. I shouldn't say agenda, but their goal. And they view it as an unbiased view to support the industry. So partnering with our member brands and partnering with the industry to get as much information as we can, condense it into really digestible, easy to understand, and having retailers be able to share that with consumers in bite-sized pieces where they can understand it. Because it's critical. I mean, all the things that we've been talking about today, the consumers are confused. They're confused about what does plant-based mean. Well, we have a very strong concerted effort to educate them, and GFI with cell-based and cultivated and precision fermentation. So there's just it's really critical. My point is this is really critical for us to continue to partner with retailers and find ways to help consumers understand in store, at the point of purchase. E-commerce is we've talked about the importance of e-commerce and how retailers are now having to continue to build out their infrastructure to meet the demand for e-commerce sales, and that provides a unique opportunity to be able to speak to them online. And then ultimately, I'll say that we're also working with retailers to take the learnings that we're learning from merchandising in stores and applying that online. How can you make it easier for shoppers to find plant-based and understand it? So these provide really great opportunities to help educate the consumer.
I just love to jump in on that last point, because I think that's an important thing, how you navigate to these plant-based products online. I know one retailer, I think it's changed, but at one point, you had to navigate to like the special diet section first, and then from within there, versus going to the chicken section and seeing your plant-based chicken option. So there's a lot you can do with online merchandising as well to just help the consumer find their options.
And we're sort of talking about it like a fait accompli, but this is really a big step that now you're starting to see plant-based options right next to the analogs that we were saying in the beginning. And that to me, it just talks about the mind shift that's happening culturally in the general zeitgeist about plant-based not being this small niche thing over here, but just this one more option for the consumer, and the consumer loves options. So it's no longer this shunned thing for just a rare few, but just making the consumer's choices more rich, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so very exciting. Okay, well, let's talk about cultivated meat, because that's got a much longer time really to get to market, even though we did see in Singapore that it's just regulated, Eat Just, and their chicken came to market at a restaurant in Singapore and is now also available for home delivery, I believe, from that same restaurant. But, not quite yet a global phenomenon, although Israel is advancing here as well on regulation. We are not quite there, and I wondered when you think we might see that in the grocery stores. I talked to a lot of people on the show, and I've got lots of different numbers from different people, but you two experts, I'm wondering when you think we'll see cultivated meat on the shelves.
Sure. Well, kind of leading up to that question, I will point out just what an important year 2020 was for the industry and how many firsts we saw. So as you said, the first regulatory approval of product for sale in Singapore. We also saw the first 2 Series B raises in the space that more than doubled the amount of money invested in the industry to date. We saw the first notable government funding, both in the US and the EU. Several other countries have been ahead of us there, but we saw the National Science Foundation grant $3.5 million to UC Davis for work on cultivated meat. And I'll say that's just a beginning. There's a need for a lot more public funding to complement the private funding we are seeing flowing into the sector, which increased, 6x just last year. We also saw the first QSR partnership, the first restaurant concept launch, and you mentioned Israel, where we saw the first head of state tasting of plant-based or a cultivated meat, And, the prime minister there went on to say that he wants to appoint a government commission to ensure that Israel are leaders in alternative protein. So it was a really exciting year. And in some of the other things we're seeing happening in the industry, right, we've seen rapid company expansion. So in 2015, there was about 4 companies in the space. Today, there's about 75. So, in just 6 years, really, really significant expansion. And we've also seen an expansion of companies serving as the picks and shovels, if you will, of the industry. So more B2B players emerging there, and much more participation from our large life science and meat companies. And that's important too, when you think about the type of capital and distribution capacity they have to bring these products to market. And we've seen some meaningful partnerships as well, including with Aleph Farms and Mitsubishi in Japan and BRF in Brazil to help commercialize these products. So all of those are really important signals to where we are in the industry and when it can come to market. And we've seen now several companies on the leading edge move into the pilot scale production phase, which is a huge proof of concept and an incredible step in the industry. And you probably saw just this week, I think it was just this week, Future Meat Technologies announced that they have a new production facility where they say they can produce about 5,000 hamburgers a day. So this all bodes really well. We've also seen Upside Foods, formerly Memphis Meats, state in their rebrand that, they plan to bring cultivated chicken to market this year pending regulatory approval. So that would indicate to me, I don't have any insider knowledge here, but that would indicate to me that they have applied for that approval. And so I think it just depends when that comes. I don't have a crystal ball and can't say it will be this year, it will be next year. But I think Singapore really kind of got the ball rolling there, right? And we do expect that we will start to definitely see more regulatory approval in more regions, certainly by 2025, as the industry moves more into demonstration scale and then towards industrial scale production by 2030 are some of our conservative estimates.
2030, industrial scale production. I'm holding you to it. It's such good news. Julie, did you want to hop in there? I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and I will. But Julie, did you want to hop in there?
I think go ahead and unpack it.
Okay, go ahead. Okay. So much to unpack there. Since we are naming people, I do want to say Blue Nalu doing cultivated fish. They are thinking that they're telling me, come on down for a tasting the end of 2021, maybe early 2022. So I know how hard Luke Cooper House is working on that, as is the entire team. So Absolutely. Cultivated fish is coming down the pipeline. You were talking about B2B, and I just want to explain to people what that is. So you're talking about cultivated fat, cultivated collagen, these other supplies that may be used, who knows, in a plant-based hybrid. So you might have a plant-based burger with cultivated fat. Something like this could happen potentially, depending on, again, more choices for the consumer, depending on if the consumer, wants to up their fiber. Meat's not going to have fiber, and that's going to be the same with cultivated meat. If they want to keep down their cholesterol, but they want to up their taste, so maybe they'll take that plant-based burger, but just a smidge of non-animal fat, cultivated meat. So
that's an important point, and we hadn't touched on that so much yet, but this idea of hybrid products. And right now we often talk about the industry as kind of plant-based, fermentation, and cultivated as 3 distinct segments. But ultimately in the future, it'll probably be more of a spectrum, right? Where on one end we're seeing fully plant-based, on one end we're seeing fully cultivated, but there'll be a lot of products that are utilizing ingredients from one or more technology to get those great sensory attributes that allows for, equivalency with the conventional animal products. And the other piece of that, so yes, exactly what you said, we might start seeing cultivated fat, for example, in otherwise plant-based burgers. But there's even other opportunities along the technology stack for cultivated meat. So who's providing the cell lines or the cell culture media for the cells to grow, the scaffolding that allows us to create that, fibrous muscle texture, and even the bioreactors. So there's opportunities all along that value chain as well.
Yes, and I'll hop in and say some incredible female founders there. So Nieves Martinez from Novel Farms, she's working on structuring and scaffolding, and Patricia Bubner from Orbillion, she's working on bioreactors and other things. So yes, it's a very exciting time. Some very smart people are in this industry. A little bit more to unpack. You were talking about who's investing and the investments going sixfold. In 2020, I believe there was 3.1 billion invested in all of these technologies, including plant-based fermented protein and cultivated meat. That was more than all of 2010 to 2019 put together. So you're seeing this rise in interest from meat companies as well as private investors, et cetera. But you're not seeing, I know you mentioned UC Davis, I understand $3.5 million. You're not seeing, as I would hope from a country as formidable as the United States, the kind of research investment that would get behind technology that is so critical to food security. And food security really is your lockdown on your own political security. I'm not sure why politicians aren't seeing that, but it really becomes an issue of national security. We saw during COVID how fragile the food security was. And ultimately, as we have more people on the planet going from 7.6 billion people to 9.8 billion people, but you're not getting more land, you're not getting more water, countries might not be so willing to share and trade food with each other. And if you don't have control of your own food supply, you really don't have global political power. That to me seems like if I were a politician, I would be on top of that. So, I look at Israel and I see that beautiful triangle that they have between government, education, their larger educational institutions, and entrepreneurs. And we're not really forming that here. And I wondered if either of you would like to comment.
Sure. Well, I'll just say I completely agree with how you laid that out, right? Alternative proteins provide a solution to these major global challenges, from food security to climate change to global hunger. I mean, these are the things that governments, exist to address. So we do expect that we will see more government investment in alternative proteins, and do hope that model that you just spoke about is replicated in more countries, as this is such a pressing issue. And it's a focus area for GFI right now, really calling on the US government to put more investment into research and development in alternative proteins. And there's some promising indicators there. So you mentioned Israel, but there's several other countries that have already put millions into these technologies and do largely look at this from a food security standpoint. So Singapore has, as well as several European countries. We've also seen investments from Canada in plant protein crops in particular. So we are calling on the government to do that, and our policy team is starting to see some interest from several U.S. policymakers that they are working with on this front, both at the state and the federal level. So at the state level, we've actually seen 2 representatives from Minnesota bring forward the first ever bipartisan legislation that would support research funding in the plant-based food industry. And this is largely to support Minnesota farmers. And then at the federal level, Representative Rosa DeLauro, who chairs the House Appropriations Committee, which is responsible for about $5 trillion in federal spending through the budget, has been repeatedly calling for parity in research funding between alternative proteins and conventional proteins, which would just be enormous if we were able to, even get kind of a fraction of the way there.
Julie, I see you nodding your head. Hop in, yeah.
Yes. We actually did sign that letter that you're talking about in that you referenced, Caroline, in Minnesota. It's very exciting to see, and along with a lot of our members, Impossible, Tofurky, and a couple of the initiatives that we're working on. We're taking this retail sales data that we have, but we're really applying it in a new and exciting way, which is in domestic sourcing of ingredients. So understanding what acreage is needed to help farmers be able to convert and grow to meet demand. So we're taking, for example, oat milk sales and being able to convert that into the groats needed to make oat milk, and then the acreage that is needed to be able to supply. So that's an initiative that we're working on. It's supply is obviously critical to meet demand, and so that's really exciting. And Caroline, you were talking about it too. We've up until this point generally have been defending bills, and now we're all becoming more proactive policies to be able to get the research needed to be able to grow and to be able to be an even playing field, which is all you can ask for, right? So I think it's just really exciting, the developments that we're seeing in all of those areas.
Yes, and it is such a large conversation that it's an existential one, really. I was speaking at the UN Global Leaders Summit recently, the Global Compact Leaders Summit recently, about farmers and how plant-based foods can be a solution for them, as well as we look for better opportunities to farm and more opportunities for farmers and more equity in the whole food process. So, one of the strange stats is that the people who actually make our food globally around the world, who are picking the food, et cetera, they're the people who have the least access to food. So there's this whole inequity throughout the food system globally, I'm speaking. So it was exciting to speak there, and it's exciting that they were open to hearing about how plant-based could be a solution, obviously in climate change. Of course, we talked about that as well, but also as food insecurity and opportunities for farmers and equity in the food supply system for people. Human rights, as well as obviously animal welfare, is an underscoring theme throughout what we're doing, of course. So exciting times in that people are starting to open up to the message in a way. Even a year ago, I was having trouble having these conversations with people. And now you see something like the UN Global Compact being interested in this conversation. So a very exciting time. But still, there are indeed white spaces. I'm wondering, I'll start with Julie, but then throw it to Caroline. What are you not seeing in the market that you'd like to see?
Seafood is the number one. It grew significantly this last year to 12 million. The potential for seafood is especially, it already wasn't an opportunity, but with Seaspiracy, again, consumers are now understanding, and when those documentaries are very important to the growth and awareness of consumers to actually make change because they're so brutal. And then retailers are asking for this innovation within shrimp and all the different types, and we're very fortunate to have data providers that can break down the existing types and forms of seafood and be able to actually quantify where the biggest opportunities are. And then innovators and companies can use that data to understand what are the biggest opportunities. And then it becomes where to merchandise them. So that's where we all come in and we work together to make it clear that this exists and it's a great alternative. So it's a huge opportunity.
Retailers must be so grateful for you. Really, I mean, you help them out so much. Right? It's
I'd like to think so.
Yeah. Caroline, I saw you jumping in there.
Oh, yeah, no, I absolutely agree with seafood. We actually have a whole sustainable seafood initiative at GFI specifically to advance alternative seafood. And it's a pretty wide open playing field right now. But really, it's a largely wide open playing field when you go beyond just the burger and ground restructured meat products, right? When we really talk about next generation products. So, we could talk about chicken, especially outside of nuggets. We could talk about pork, the many different forms that is served in. But, I think one of the helpful ways to frame this is really by, what are the barriers for consumers right now in trying plant-based products? And so we often hear, most surveys show the number one barriers are perception that it's not going to taste as good, right? And then when you actually ask consumers who've tried products and what it is that might be contributing to their not liking the product, the top three issues are around taste, which really we can address from a few standpoints: flavor, formulation, but also the opportunities in the plant proteins themselves, right? So many plant proteins have kind of bitter or beany notes that contribute to this off flavor. And there's currently a lot of flavor additives or flavor maskers that are used, and we can see innovation there. But also in the processing of plant proteins for a cleaner taste, or in diversifying the plant proteins that we're using that might have better sensory attributes. So for example, mung bean apparently doesn't really require the flavor maskers that some of the other products do, but a lot of these other plant proteins that could make really great bases for plant-based meat and other plant-based products haven't been scaled up to really be viable options for large players. The other area we hear is around moisture. So there's a huge opportunity in fat encapsulation, also other moisture encapsulation, or color and flavor encapsulation. And those would contribute not only to a better sensory experience, but a better cooking experience. Really impacts the way the product smells and looks and even sounds when it's cooking. And by better encapsulating those things, you can actually use less in the formulation. So perhaps driving cost reductions on the COGS side while improving the flavor characteristics. And a pretty fun thing to think about, if you're kind of going for your ultimate, if we could find a way to encapsulate liquid fats such as omega-3s to replace saturated fats in products. We could, for example, even have a heart-healthy plant-based bacon with your omegas. And then I know we're running out of time, so I'll say texture is the other one. So there's a lot of opportunity to improve the texture of plant-based products to get at that more muscular animal muscle texture. And so, the key challenge really is convincing these globular plant proteins to behave like the more fibrillar animal proteins. And so high moisture extrusion is really the main way that the industry is doing that today, twin screw high moisture extrusion. But there's a few challenges there. One, there's just a huge bottleneck in companies being able to find a co-manufacturer to produce their products that way, because the equipment is very expensive, the knowledge is very limited, and the process is highly variable. So looking for improvements in the extrusion process. And I know you were over at Bueller earlier this month, and they had announced that they found a way to double the production capacity. So that's a great step forward. But there's still other improvements we could see to address this bottleneck. And then there's other technology, emerging tech to texturize plant proteins, such as shear cell technology, fiber spinning, and even 3D printing. And then we touched on this earlier, but the use of whole biomass fermentation to get at that meat-like texture. So I think it's helpful to frame the white spaces, and in all those areas, we really need to see improvements and breakthroughs to drive products that have the same sensory attributes.
Yeah, again, so much to unpack there. So you're really talking about all the B2B players that could help make a great product. And I just keep thinking of Bruce Friedrich in the back of my head, like it's taste, price, convenience. It's taste, price, convenience, which is the mantra I think of for GFI. I want to unpack a little bit there. So you're talking about alternative proteins. Right now, we're really heavy on wheat and soy and a little bit pea too, but pea has some masking issues. So brands are trying to get away from those. And I think you're going to be seeing things like mung bean, but also seeds, and pumpkin seeds keeps coming on my radar, and water lentils keeps coming on my radar. And again, you were saying mung bean. So I'm always, when I'm working with my brands, I'm telling them, the consumer is ready to take in information about their food. So we've got a story to tell depending on what our protein is. And that's an interesting opportunity for brands to really carve out, who they are and what's their story. When you're talking about locking in moisture, some of the problems for brands is that coconut oil runs. So when you fry up a burger and it's made with coconut oil, that doesn't always stay in the burger, and then it has a coconut smell. I work with a company called Alianza Team, and they study, I don't know if you know them, they're a wonderful resource. They study animal meats, and then they replicate animal fat from plant-based fats, and it's usually a blend of plant-based fats. So it's an opportunity to not be so dependent on coconut oil. And then you if you're not using coconut oil, which runs so much, you have the opportunity to increase moisture because it doesn't run out. So some just exciting technology. Then there's Umiyami in France that's working on alternatives to two-screw extrusion moisture extrusion, high moisture extrusion. So you're getting a healthier product in the end. High moisture extrusion usually gets rid of a lot of the fiber, so you're getting some of the nutrients away in a situation that you would rather not have. So I think they're very exciting about the technology that's coming to not be so heavily dependent on high moisture extrusion. So it's just a very interesting time. And when we talk about the lack of co-manufacturing opportunities and how this is a bottleneck, and so one of our white spaces, it's one of the reasons why when people say, oh gosh, well, would you work with large meat and dairy corporations? I say, yes, ultimately, I want those distribution channels. I want those co-manufacturing relationships, and I want those advertising budgets. I want to hear how manly it is to eat plants. I want that dialogue, that zeitgeist dialogue to shift. So ultimately, yes, I would work with larger corporations. Okay. Speaking of larger corporations, the CEO of Cargill recently said that he anticipated in 3 years. So we've been talking about what's going to happen in 2030, or sometimes we'll see studies about where we're going to be in 2040. That's anticipated that alternative meat, the fermented proteins, cultivated meat, and plant-based meat will be 60% of the market by 2040, which makes us no longer alternative because we're the thing. But okay, whatever. But we're not talking about 2040. We're talking about the next 3 years, that plant-based meat would be 10% of the meat market. So that would show cannibalization. I'm wondering if you guys have any predictions about where we'll be in 3 years.
Looking at the numbers and the trends like we do, we live in these numbers, and the fact that just even plant-based meat share alone has doubled or increased 50% in the past year. Combined with all the things that we've been talking about, we can combine so much of what we've been talking about, and the fact that there are now, so we're talking strictly plant-based meat. Is that what you?
Sure,
not just
sure.
Total, because I think that there's a lot to be learned from the fact that there are so many categories across the store that are growing and catching catching shoppers' attention and bringing more excitement into. But if we're talking just meat, it just goes back to merchandising again. When you see plant-based milk is 15% of the of olive fluid milk, and half of all milk sold in natural is plant-based milk. So if you start looking at those percentages as share, I think it's with retailers actively looking to merchandise in the same way. Absolutely, I think it's an absolute.
Yeah,
if not more.
If not more, really, if not more. And an exciting stat about plant-based milk is it's 15% of the category, give or take, and it's about 40 to 41% of household penetration. So that's always a fun number. Mm-hmm. Caroline, what do you think? Where are we going to be in 3 years?
Yeah, well, I'd love to see his prediction come true. And, he's the CEO of Cargill, so he might know all kinds of things they have in the works that we don't know about. Also, right, they have many customers in the space, retailers. And so, that'd be great to see. I do think it might be a little on the bullish side, just because it would require if you do the math based on retail sales and where we are today, that would require about a 50% CAGR over the next several years, right? So
come on, lucky seven.
I think, plant-based meat saw almost that during COVID, but we have to also acknowledge, the shift in distribution channels from food service to retail, driving some of that. So I think, we've seen more 20-some% growth over the last several years. So I'm probably a little bit more comfortable with a more maybe conservative CAGR of around 30%, which would put us at 5% share of the meat category by 2025, which, gets us well on the way to the kind of general consensus you see among the Wall Street analysts and the consultant firms who've put out projections. Now, many of them have that, estimate 10% by 2030 or 2035. That said, there's really opportunity for some game changers that could massively accelerate the growth, right? So if we see more supportive policies and regulations, such as, taxation on greenhouse gas emissions or something that, impacts the ability for a lot of conventional animal products to not price in the externalities. So if those were priced in and we saw the price of conventional meat come up, that would also, I think, really impact the growth of plant-based products. So certainly it's possible, but I think, ultimately we know the addressable market here is so massive and the potential is so clear. But it's not going to happen overnight. So.
Yes, I think very, very interesting. You could see some major players coming in. So if you saw any kind of shift in subsidies, that would shift something really quickly. I don't think we will, though, in the next 3 years. But we are running out of time. But very quickly, I wanted to ask Julie's take on, from the retail standpoint, when do you think we might see carbon pricing? I think that's such a fascinating conversation and would also be a game changer for people to really understand the connection between their food choices and the environment. Do you see that coming to the retail situation anytime soon?
You said carbon pricing.
Where you would be able to see the real cost of your food by having the carbon imprint, carbon impact score, if you will. I'm sorry, there's a term that it's not coming to mind, but like a carbon impact score on pack.
That. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I can't say when, or I think that's something that, especially with the younger generation, you have a massive part of our population that is buying on their values. And if they can see right there what their impact is on the environment, and that is being, that's a big part of our education, a big part of understanding of retailers is who that future consumer is. It's now, but it's the future, and that's the direction that they need to go. So yes, I do think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Caroline.
We started to see a little bit of that out of Europe, and I think we'll probably see that there first, right? But I would love to see that trickle into the U.S. stores as well.
Yes. There's a restaurant in the East Coast in Rhode Island, Plant City. They actually have on one of their walls, they're a plant-based food court, the only plant-based mall food court really in the United States. And they've got several restaurants in that plant-based food court. And one of them has, I think it's Plant X, their restaurant Plant X has on the wall that this restaurant is only using energy from wind. And they say that that's always the thing that resonates most with their customers, and they all read it and they take pictures of it and they put it on social media, and it's very meaningful to them. So I think that sort of transparency on front of pack about what it really takes to bring these products to market is going to be meaningful and a game changer as we talk about game-changing alternatives in the next couple of years. Okay, our last two questions really quickly is how I like to wrap up the interviews. I'm wondering, I'll start with Caroline and then on to Julie. If you're ever having a bad day, is there a phrase that you tell yourself to get yourself back in the game?
For me, it's probably less about something I tell myself and maybe more like an action I need to take at that moment. Just, taking a break from whatever it is and playing with my dog or taking him for a walk or getting some movement to just kind of move that energy through and get back into it.
Julie?
Yeah, it's always been and serves me well. Never give up. It sounds cheesy, but it's actually, people in my life can attest to it. And it's my mantra.
I love that, because when it rains, it pours, and certainly that's a good one. Okay, so Julie, you're running around, you're super busy, you don't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
Like every day, dates and peanut butter.
Together?
Yes, so good. Yes, you must try it.
Oh my gosh. And do you stick the peanut butter in the date, or do you?
It's not pretty.
Okay. Well, we don't care about that.
We just combine them in any way possible and eat it together.
Oh, that is so good. I usually take a salted cashew and I stick it in the date, and then I have this very portable snack when I go hiking or whatever. I'll have a bunch of them, and I have my fat and my salt, and it's very sweet and good. Yeah, it's great. Okay, Caroline, What's your go-to snack?
Yeah, well, salty sweet is always great, but I throughout the day am always getting up to go and get more dark chocolate. So that's my go-to. Lots of dark chocolate.
I love this. When I think of chocolate, I think of a vitamin. That's just my vitamin of choice is chocolate. I want to thank you both for being with me and for all that you do and for diving into the numbers with us. Again, as we come on the midway point really to 2021, it's great to see how healthy really the plant-based business industry is and where we're going and all of our predictions and all the innovation and all the reasons there are for hope for people, the planet, and animals. It's almost cliche now. We say people, the planet, and animals, people, the planet, and animals. But really, if you address the food supply system, you take care, as you all have talked about here, of so many major global issues with one fell swoop. So how often do you get to say that? So Godspeed to all the work that you're doing, and thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Wonderful to be here.
Yes, great to have you. You guys stay put. Everybody else on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Thanks for being with me, and I will see you next week.